Hey, my watch says 10 o'clock. So I just muted everybody for now. And then I'm going to give you some directions. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. And then I'm going to give everybody some directions. There are still people joining, so to multitask here. I got two computers with two different Zoom sessions going on, and then I'm trying to admit everybody as soon as come on. So anyway, I wanted to wish you all a great morning. I think it's getting to be 100 degrees out here in Tucson again. Yesterday was 102. I do if it even broke a record, but I think if it didn't, probably most likely very close to it. I'm Peter Chan. I'm the president of Tucson Chinese Association, which operates the Tucson Chinese Cultural Center. And I wanted to welcome you and thank you for being here today with this special Zoom session that we are going to learn about the book that was written by Dr. Venit Shelton, Herbs. And you'll hear from her in just a couple minutes. But let me read you allow me to read a short bio on Dr. Venit Shelton. She's an associate professor of history at Claremont McKenna College. She earned her PhD in history from Stanford University and was an assistant professor of history and environmental studies at Reed College prior to her present position. She studies and teaches the social history of America West with a particular focus on race and the environment. Her first book, Squaw Republic, Land and the Politics of Monopoly in California from 1880 to 1900. It was published by the California Press in 2013, studies the ideal of landed independence and its significance of Gilded Age politics in California. Her second book, Herbs and Roots, A History of Chinese Doctors in the American Medical Marketplace, published in 2019 by Yale University Press, chronicles the long history of Chinese medicine in the United States from the colonial period to the present. It's also edited a series of US history textbooks, Gale, Cengage Learning. Her opinion pieces on the history of medicine and teaching historical empathy have appeared in the Washington, Los Angeles Times, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. In addition to her writing, she has on historical movie sets in the American West and appear on the Travel Channel's Expedition Unknown. Speaking about the Lewis and Clark expedition and the construction of the United States' first transcontinental railroad. Speaking of railroad, there is a display at the Tucson Chinese Cultural Center that is funded by one of our board member and her spouse. So when you have a chance, when the center reopens, please stop by and see part of the West Coast Railroad history, as we are, part of it from all the way from Rio Rico, Nogales up here through to the I-10 corridor. So without further ado, I'm going to let Dr. Venit Shelton talk about her, book and learn a little bit more about her work. So hold on a second. Oh yeah, there you go.
I am unmuted now. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. I was supposed to come out and be with you in person back in May, and I'm so sorry for so many reasons that didn't work out. I love Tucson. My mother and father-in-law lived in Tucson for almost a decade, and I really always loved going out there and enjoying the beautiful Sonoran Desert and shopping at La Encantada, which I really miss a lot. But I'm delighted to be here today. I'm sharing this book with you, which features the family of someone you may know, and the person who connected me to all of you, Anna Dawn. So she's with us here today and is going to share some of her family's history as well. I'm going to try to share my screen. I'm going to have to ask my host to enable that. If you go down to share screen, there should be a little up caret by you that says allow multiple users to share screen. So if you could give that a try, I would love to show you some images that are from the book. Great, thank you. All right, and if you could just give me a thumbs up and let me know that you can see my screen. Anyone? Yep, everyone can see? Yep, thumbs up, great, thank you. So this is the cover of the book. Now, for many Americans, when we think about the history of traditional Chinese medicine in this country, we tend to think about, let me say this, right? Acupuncture and the nationwide frenzy for it in the 1970s. But of course, acupuncture was just one of many traditional Chinese therapies, and its discovery, or I would argue its rediscovery in the 1970s, is actually the end point of my book, not its beginning. Chinese medicine has a very long history in the United States. It dates back to the colonial period, extends up to the present. Long before mass migration from China to the United States, Chinese materia medica crossed the oceans. It actually crossed the oceans in both directions. And then in the 1850s, as the first waves of Chinese immigrants began to come to the United States, doctors were among them. Now, there were a wide range of healing practices in China, but up until the 1970s, for a variety of reasons that I can explain, immigrant doctors tended to come from a kind of middling class of merchant physicians who specialized, and they specialized in a couple of things. They learned diagnosis by pulse or pulsology, and they learned herbalism in family businesses. Back home in China, in their family businesses, they would have specialized in making one proprietary remedy, but when they came to the United States, they had to learn to be generalists. They became general practitioners. So herbalists in the United States diagnosed and treated all manner of ailments. Very often they did things that had no bearing on herbalism. They set bones, for example. Sometimes they delivered babies. Sometimes they provided abortions. Chinese doctors in America served both Chinese and non-Chinese patients. And over time, so this is actually an advertisement, someone who's practicing in Los Angeles in 1880, and you don't see it, but on the back side, he lists all his services first in English and then in Spanish. And so what you see is that Chinese doctors in the United States were advertising their services in English and Spanish language newspapers, and over time, Chinese medicine, along with other medical knowledge systems deemed irregular or alternative, both facilitated and undermined the consolidation of Western style medical science. So this is really what my book is about. It chronicles about 200 years of the history of Chinese medicine in the United States, its history of transplantation and transformations, but it's also a history of American medicine, its professionalization, its regulation, and it is more generally a history of Chinese immigrant life. Now, I began researching and writing this book when I was teaching in Oregon. As my host mentioned, my first job out of grad school up in Portland, Oregon. And just about anyone in Oregon eventually becomes familiar with this fellow, Dr. Ing He, who practiced medicine from 1888 to 1948, so very long career at this pretty remarkable apothecary called Kamwa Chung, way out in Eastern Oregon in a town called John Day, very rural, very impoverished actually part of that state. When Inghe was too elderly to continue practicing, continue to running the business, when he was too kind of elderly and infirm to run his business, his nephew, who was also an herbalist, came out to John Day, moved his uncle to a nursing home in Portland, and then locked the door. He just kind of closed the door and locked it on this building and left everything sitting there in place, just gathering dust for nearly 30 years. So this is a picture of Inghe when he was older, outside of his business. And then in the 1970s, the state took control of the property, and when they opened it up, they discovered this treasure trove of historical artifacts. It's a little like Tutankhamun's tomb, you know, tins and jars and boxes, company records, personal papers, personal effects, and so forth. So today, Kamwa Chung is a state heritage site. It's an archive, it's a museum. You can go and visit if ever you want to drive about 5 hours into the wilderness from Portland. And Inghe himself has been the subject of an award-winning documentary that aired on Oregon Public Broadcasting. So now I became aware of Inghe while living in Oregon, and you know, as any good social historian would, I began to wonder about others like him. So I began to ask these questions, you know, how many Chinese doctors were practicing in the United States? You know, where were they? What did they do? More broadly, I wanted to understand their lived experiences and what they could tell us about their time and place. So, you know, I didn't really have an expectation that I would find very much. I thought maybe I would find enough to write a nice 20 to 25 page article. But it turns out that Chinese doctors were everywhere. Everywhere there were Chinese people, there were Chinese doctors. They were in every state of the Union, as well as Canada and Mexico. But unsurprisingly, they were more numerous in the places where Chinese immigrants concentrated, especially California and the West, which is my area of expertise. So you know, Chinese doctors were a small but significant cohort as part of the mass immigration from China that began in the 1850s. And after 1850, in any given year, you would probably find no more than 200 full-time practitioners of Chinese medicine working in the United States. But they assumed an outsized importance in their community. They were, of course, healthcare providers, they were educators, they trained their children and extended families in traditional practices. This is the picture from the cover of my book, and I just love it because you can see kind of peeking out in the doorway this little boy, you know, so I think this really emphasizes the way in which these were family businesses, right? Multi-generational, sometimes family businesses. And they provided essential services, especially at a time when mainstream medical care was not an option for Chinese immigrants, when they were excluded or otherwise, let's say, discriminated against in kind of mainstream medical facilities. But, and I think this is important, not all of the work they did was strictly medical. Chinese apothecaries were recreational and religious centers. They often served as post offices. A Chinese herbalist might be his community's banker, translator, labor broker, grocer. Chinese herbalists sponsored new arrivals. They extended charity often whenever possible. And after Chinese exclusion barred the entry of working class Chinese, some Chinese doctors did participate in the forgery and smuggling networks that allowed their countrymen to circumvent immigration restrictions. Now, my sources for this project were fairly eclectic. You know, archival research is really the bread and butter of professional historians, but there are very, very few archives or museums that actually collect the records of Chinese herbalists practicing in the United States. So I pretty quickly exhausted those possibilities and had to turn to things like archaeological records, newspaper and travel accounts, court cases. Chinese doctors end up going to court quite a bit. They get arrested and have to go to court. But a lot of what I had to work with were print advertisements in Chinese, in English, and to a lesser extent in Spanish. So this is the earliest example I have found of a Chinese doctor advertising his services in the United States. And if you look down at the bottom, I've highlighted the date, right? So this is April of 1799. In April of 1799, an advertisement ran in a Harrisburg, Pennsylvania newspaper. A man identifying himself as Chinese doctor, Dr. John Howard, announced that he was seeing patients at his home on 2nd Street. Howard claimed that he had come from Canton, so present-day Guangzhou, and he promised to treat a range of ailments with herbs and roots that he had imported from China. His advertisements ran in the Harrisburg newspaper through the spring and early summer of 1799, and then he moved to nearby Carlisle and continued advertising there through the fall of 1800. I believe that John Howard was the first practitioner of Chinese medicine in the United States, at least the first to advertise his services in English. But who was he? Was he in fact Chinese? We do know that Chinese men and women did travel abroad and often at great distances prior to 1800. They went to Europe, they went to India, they went to other parts of Asia, as well as to Mexico and Hawaii. But relatively few Chinese migrants went to the United States or the British colonies that would become the United States. In fact, their presence there went unrecorded until the 1810s, when a few religious students and domestic servants began to appear in the written record. So John Howard, if he was in fact Chinese, would have preceded those men's arrival by more than a decade. John Howard very well could have been an American pseudonym that he adopted because it was more easily pronounced and remembered by his English-speaking clientele. And that was something that later generations of Chinese herbalists did do quite frequently, adopted a pseudonym. Right? But the honest truth is I know very little about him. I could find very little about him. He may not have been Chinese at all. He might have been just someone who spent significant time in China, either as a foreign merchant or as a missionary. He did not appear at all in the 1800 census for either Harrisburg or Carlisle, nor other public records, aside from a few mentions in newspapers and a medical journal. When a Connecticut newspaper announced the opening of his business in 1800, it listed the many diseases and afflictions he cured, and it praised his ability, called him a descendant of Galen and Hippocrates. But the announcement really said nothing about Howard's nativity. If he were in fact Chinese, the Connecticut newspaper did not think that that was important enough to mention. So the idea that someone in South Central Pennsylvania would be practicing Chinese medicine was in fact not very surprising for people who lived in that time and place, because in 1800, 50 years before mass immigration from China to the United States began, Americans were to varying degrees already familiar with Chinese medicine. Americans in the colonial period and early republic descended from a European world with a long-standing curiosity for all things Chinese, including traditional Chinese medicine. And in early America, among the educated elite, there was a great appetite for information about China, its philosophy, its history, and also its medical practices. In the 19th century, in the second half of the 19th century, Chinese herbalists were still advertising in English, and they were borrowing advertising strategies from makers of patent or proprietary remedies. These included things like very conventional display advertisements in newspapers, longer form advertising booklets, as well as, and these are my favorites, these are trade cards from Kam Wah Chung. So Chinese doctors in this era particularly targeted non-Chinese women, both English and Spanish speaking. in their advertisements, as we can see in this example. Throughout the 19th century, American women were the major consumers and practitioners of what we think of now as irregular medicine. And the American popular press often portrayed women as overly susceptible to what they called Oriental quackery. But the press really failed to recognize the ways in which Western-style medical science failed to meet the needs of female patients. Chinese medicine, I argue, likely appealed to women on a number of levels. Maybe the distance and discretion offered by Chinatown offices was important to some, but perhaps more importantly, the prevalence of herbal remedies and non-invasive procedures in Chinese medicine might have been attractive to women otherwise facing the prospect of really painful and dangerous gynecological surgeries. So these business cards from the 1910s advertising Kamwachang aim to sell not only, as it says here, right, medical herbs, groceries, Chinese goods, and general merchandise, but also a vision of modern, affluent femininity. So each card, and this is just a sample of them, each card portrayed a white woman, Dorothy. I don't have an image of this one up here, but there's one of one named Dorothy who is kind of gaily ice skating. This one, here's Mildred here tipping her hat. Margaret has this, you know, very fancy, like draped silk wrap. And here we have Clara with a fur trimmed coat. These were not images of the Eastern Oregon ranching and farm wives who patronized Kamwachang, but maybe they were representations of what they aspired to be. Now, aside from print advertising, my other major source for this project were interviews with the American-born children of Chinese herbalists. For example, your neighbor, maybe someone you know, Anna Dawn. And I'm going to show a picture of her parents, Chan Du Sung and Aster Lee. This is, neither of these children is Anna. I'm not sure which of your siblings these are. Who are these siblings, Anna? These are your older siblings, right?
It's my sister and my older brother, Lyman.
Yeah, outside of the family business. So I'm going to turn this over to Anna now to tell the story of her parents.
Well, yes, I'm a daughter of an herbalist. I'm a granddaughter of an herbalist. I'm a great-granddaughter of an herbalist. So we go back a long way, but not as long as the origin of Chinese medicine, some 3,000 years ago. I remember my dad relating the story of the Yellow Emperor, who had an extensive garden. From it, he would take various herbs and roots, flowers, and brew various teas. And then he would note the effects that these teas had on the body. So from these observations and through the centuries, we have today this historic compilation of the curative powers of herbs. Well, my dad came from China in 1916 as a student, legally, because at the time this was the Chinese Exclusion Act kept people from China coming over unless you were a student or a merchant. And he was 18 years old, and he apprenticed in herbalism with his uncle in Oakland, California. And this uncle was really ahead of his time because he had several nephews that he trained so that they could establish satellite offices of the Chan and Kong Herb Company. So when my father was ready, he did just that. He ran one of the satellite offices for my uncle. But love intervened. He met my mother, who was born in San Francisco, and he courted her, taking her boating on Lake Merritt in Oakland. They married on May 29, 1922. Eventually, after working for my uncle for several years, my dad decided to strike out on his own. From 1928 to 1940, the Chan family was on the move, from California to Washington to Colorado to Idaho, and finally to Tucson, Arizona. My first three siblings were born in San Francisco. I was born in Yakima, Washington. One of my younger brothers was born in Walla Walla, Washington. Another was born in Twin Falls, Idaho. So my brother Edward was able to document all of our travels by the school report cards that he kept. I relate this travel history because Dad was not the typical herbalist who settled in just one community and served the Chinese community. He had a big family, and if he couldn't earn enough in his herbal practice to take care of us, he wouldn't hesitate to move. His clientele were non-Chinese. He always told me that if you could speak English and communicate, you never have to fear and accomplish anything. He obviously believed that. There were cities where he was very successful, and we would have Saturday night shopping sprees in town, and Dad would take us on trips. In other cities, Mom would feed us juk, which is a rice gruel, just to stretch our food budget. We kids, unknowing of our parents' economic circumstances, loved juk and never knew it was a survival mode that Mom was using. Typically, in searching for a new office, Dad would bus to a prospective city and find the local Chinatown, if there was one, where he would introduce himself and inquire about the new city. If he liked what he heard, then he'd find a suitable house where we would live and where he would practice his herbal medicine. And then he'd go to the local newspaper and submit these ads, such as you saw that in the previous presentation with Tamara. Then came the big move of family, furniture, and all of the herbs. And how my mother managed these 20 moves in their married life is mind-boggling to me. And I, for the longest time, did not know that most people are born, raised, and live to their dying day in one place. My mother is also atypical of Chinese housewives. She had a third-grade education, but learned to read and write English and Chinese from my father. She was my dad's right-hand man. After Dad had diagnosed the patient's medical problem and prescribed the herbs to be used, Mom would gather the various herbs from various drawers of herbs and boil them into a tea. One dose for the patient to drink while she was there, and the rest packaged into bottles for a week's supply. Was he successful in curing his patients via herbal medicine? I can only point to the many testimonials which his patients wrote telling of their cure. These were printed in local newspapers as part of our advertising. Advertising testimonials that Dr. Shelton referred to earlier. Another indication of the efficacy of Dad's herbal treatment might be the fact that as Dad traveled from city to city, some of his patients continued to follow him. So that is my presentation. Back to you, Tamara.
That's great. And I mean, Anna, I think this wasn't said, but Anna actually became the kind of family archivist. And when I visited Tucson back in, I think, 2013, and met Anna for the first time, she had these Tupperware bins, huge Tupperware bins full of the family records, the business records, the prescription pads, the plates that were used for the advertising, to print the advertisements. And Anna has since very generously deposited all of that in the Claremont University library. So they're open to researchers. If any, in the future, they'll be available to anyone who wants to write more about Chinese herbalists or Anna's family. I also wanted to say that one of the things I learned from Anna, and this was kind of an important point for me ultimately, was, well, I should back up and say, before I met Anna and I'd be going and kind of talking about this project and giving papers and presentations, I always got this question like, well, were there any women, where are the women? Were any of the herbalists women? And I would always say something like, well, Chinese culture, mostly they're men, and I haven't really found any women. But then when I heard Anna's story, I started to realize there are women, there are all of these wives and sometimes daughters. They're just not working in the front room. They're all working in the back room, you know, compounding prescriptions, and they're not the names that are on the advertisement. They're not the people who are necessarily interfacing with the patients, but they are this integral part of the business. So talking to Anna really kind of opened my eyes to the whole world of the back room. And now, you know, I kind of went forward and found so many more women who were working essentially as pharmacists, you know, and sometimes getting more involved in that and actually working as practitioners and doctors. And so that was for me a really important turning point. So thanks, Anna. And I just wanted to kind of go forward a little bit and tell you more about the book. Not too much more because I do want to leave time for questions. But as I began to kind of flesh out this picture, you know, through these various sources and through interviews with people like Anna, I became really interested in the ways that their histories intersected with the history of American medicine more broadly. So while this is a book that begins way back in the 18th century and it ends in the late 20th century, I'm really mostly interested in the late 19th and early 20th century. This is an era that historians usually call the long progressive era. It was a really critical time for the history of Chinese and the history of medicine in the United States. So I think it's been mentioned a couple times now. Anna mentioned it too, right? In 1882, Congress passed its first Chinese Exclusion Act, which prohibited working class Chinese from entering the country. And it caused a decline in Chinese population over time. A shrinking stock of those co-ethnic clientele may have compelled Chinese herbalists to cast a wider net. So you start to see an increase in English and Spanish language advertisements after 1882. Around the same time, a new science of disease transmission based on the germ theory was becoming popular with formally trained European and American physicians. Beginning in the 1890s, the American Medical Association, the AMA, still very much with us today, began to partner with state and local governments to standardize medical education and licensing around the principles of the germ theory of disease. So the AMA was really attempting through that to monopolize the American medical marketplace and drive unlicensed doctors, including the Chinese, out of business. They began to promote these new licensing exams that concentrated on their approved version of medical science and pharmacology. And they championed new laws that imposed fines and jail sentences on doctors practicing without a license. You might recall earlier I mentioned I have a lot of court cases and arrest records. It's because Chinese doctors kept getting arrested for violating these new licensing laws. And so this was the moment that Chinese doctors became increasingly active in the American medical marketplace. You might be thinking to yourself, this is not a good time to get involved in American healthcare business. And indeed, anti-Chinese racism prevented nearly all Chinese herbalists from sitting for licensing exams or otherwise securing the legal right to practice. So, you know, they practiced without a license and they faced all the consequences of that. Now, it can be really difficult to square the popularity of Chinese herbal medicine, its widespread consumption amongst American patients with prevalent anti-Chinese racism. Throughout the 19th century, Americans embraced Orientalist perceptions of Asians as backwards, as barbarous, and effeminate. As also, and this is what these images show, as disease-carrying, as filthy. And all of these stereotypes, all these prejudices justified exclusionatory and discriminatory practices targeting Asian nations and immigrants. What we see in the record is that such racist thinking extended to the realm of Chinese medicine. Attacks on Chinese doctors in English language media frequently ridiculed their practices as backwards, as unscientific, and public health officials unfairly identified American Chinatowns as sites of contagion and Chinese bodies as disease vectors. Yet scientific medicine's monopoly on the medical marketplace was far from complete. And what I argue is that Chinese herb businesses flourished in the spaces where regular doctors had not yet consolidated their control. So I argue that for American patients skeptical of modern medical science, criticism of Chinese medicine could also constitute its allure. In the book, I detail how Chinese doctors' advertising effectively self-orientalized, right? In their advertisements, they were effectively self-orientalizing. They were playing on their Chinese, non-Chinese patients' racialized expectations of Asian cultures in multiple and sometimes contradictory ways. And they overcame anti-Chinese racism by embracing and perpetuating anti-Chinese racism. Now, my book ends with a history that is still very much unfolding. The valiant efforts among Chinese and Chinese American scientists from the 1970s to today to de-orientalize Chinese medicine by explaining its efficacy through Western-style scientific models and methods. Biomedical scientists have been predictably slow to embrace Chinese therapies, which remain I would say, inconsistently accessible to the average patient. But the deliberate speed of Western-style science is not solely to blame. After generations of successful self-orientalizing, practitioners of traditional Chinese medicine really have few incentives to de-orientalize. In the American medical marketplace, Chinese medicine has thrived as an alternative and not a complement to regular medicine. So that's all I have for you for today. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have for the next 20 minutes or so, and I bet Anna would be happy to answer any questions you might have of her. Right, Anna? Yeah? Okay.
Right.
Okay, great.
Thank you. So I have all the audience text me the questions so that we can minimize all the background noise.
And if you want, I can stop sharing my screen. We can go back to a normal view there.
All right, so I have a few questions already. So first of all, I want to thank Dr. Shelton and Anna Dawn for being here today and spending some time with us. And I think this is such a great eye-opening experience for many of us, including myself, to learn a lot more about Chinese medicine in the way that most of us have not thought about the United States from 100+ years ago to the current 21st century. The first question I have is to Dr. Shelton, and would you be talking a little bit more about the actual herbs itself, right? And then another question from another participant is, what is the source of these Chinese herbs used? Were they able to grow these herbs in the US, or were they able to discover some of the herbs native to the US for different type of remedies?
Great question. So when I started this project, I started research for this project back in 2011, and I was living in Oregon, and I was working with practitioners at the Oregon College of Oriental Medicine, and they told me two things when I started. They said all of the herbs, all the botanical, zoological, mineral ingredients for these remedies were sourced in China because of the specificity with which everything needed to be procured, harvested, cultivated, whatever, right? So if you're familiar with traditional Chinese medicine, you know that it's various component parts. It's not just about like a specific species of plant or animal or whatever. It's actually about where is it growing, under what moon is it harvested, at what time of year, like there are all these very particular ways that traditional herbalism thinks about procuring its material. So I was told that. I was also told you will never find a Chinese doctor performing an abortion because that's antithetical to the principles of traditional Chinese medicine. So that's what these practitioners at the Oregon College for Oriental Medicine told me I would find. That turns out to be not true. So Chinese doctors did procure most of what they sold in China for just those reasons I said, and they would be harvested or otherwise procured and then dried or otherwise prepared for long distance shipping, sold to wholesalers, and then sent to San Francisco. And from San Francisco, they were distributed really widely. So that was most of what they had. But the fact of the matter was, the supply lines were not always sufficient to stock these businesses. So a lot of herbalists started experimenting with substitutes. Very often they experimented with what was locally available. So you see some swaps, like instead of like a particular species of Chinese snake, they'd use a rattlesnake. Instead of tiger bones, they might use bobcat bones. There's a lot of foraging nearby or growing their own. They end up growing a lot of things locally, like ginkgo biloba and a couple of other things that are frequently used. So, and this is accelerated during World War II and right after World War II, when there was an embargo on goods shipped from communist China. Chinese herbalists who wanted to stay in business had to find different ways of substituting. There were ways of circumventing it. I talked to one, a son of a Chinese herbalist who lives in Los Angeles now, and he was a college student in Los Angeles in the 50s when there was an embargo on Chinese goods. And he became a smuggler. His dad, who was in Macau, would ship him, as long as he would ship him little boxes under 20 pounds. And if it was under 20 pounds, it wouldn't get inspected at customs. And so he would ship him like box by box supplies. And then this college student would take the bus from his dorm down to Chinatown in Los Angeles and sell like 20 pounds worth of herbs to the herbalist there. So I thought that was a great story. He wouldn't let me include that in the book. He told me I didn't have permission to write it in the book, but I just tell it to people, and I trust you all, keep it to yourselves. So Chinese herbalists were doing a lot of local substitution, for sure.
Okay, this question is for Anna. One of the participants asked, where was your dad's store? Was it in downtown Tucson?
Oh, on Stone Avenue and Helen, right across from where Pima College is now. Roosevelt School was across the street, and I went to Roosevelt School. My mother used to do, when we'd have the PTA fairs, she'd do all the hot dogs, and we'd carry them over to the school to sell.
So right by where the Gold's Gym.
Where Lee's liquor store is now.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
That's where we were. Dad always found a house. The front part was where the reception room and Dad's office, and then the rest of us were kind of in the back behind closed doors. You know, you never saw all the 6 kids behind the closed doors, and the front. You know, the minute a customer or a patient came in, we vamoosed to the back.
Yeah, there's a follow-up question to you too, Anna. They ask, did your dad or your family grow some of the Chinese traditional medicinal remedies, you know, around?
No, he did not. In fact, when he couldn't get, as Tamara says, during the war, we couldn't get any more herbs from China. So he had to close up shop. He used all the herbs that he had, and then we had to quit. So that was the end of his herbal business, like in 1940, 41 or 42. There weren't any herbs coming from China except by contraband. And I guess we weren't privy to that guy that was bringing the little boxes in.
A lot of people went out of business in that period, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. What types of ailments did herbs generally address or prevent? And are there any Chinese herbalists in Tucson today? I can answer the second one, but the first part of that question was, what type of ailments did herbs generally can address or prevent?
I mean, herbalists back in the day, like historically, this class of herbalists, they would treat kind of anything. But I would say generally what I see a lot of are people with digestive issues. That seems to be a kind of major concern amongst patients. But very often I'll see in the record patients going to herbalists if they have a growth, like a tumor or something, that they don't want to go to a surgeon to have lanced. I'm pointing to my neck only because I'm thinking like, you know, a thyroid type of thing. Yeah, there's a lot of like patients approaching herbalists saying, you know, I'm afraid to have surgery, but I have to have this thing excised. Can you try to shrink it with herbs? So what other kinds of, yeah, I think those are kind of main things. So intestinal,
You know,
herbs.
in my dad's advertisement, I can always remember female problems because, as you said, he addressed a lot of the women's problems. And I can remember distinctly in a female problem, do you have female? So I don't know what that meant.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely could mean things like cancers, right? Gynecological cancers, regulating menses, so women who have irregular periods. Sometimes I'll see, this is a euphemistic way of saying this, but interrupting menses, which is actually for terminating pregnancies. So yeah, Chinese doctors definitely did a little bit of everything. And I don't know what the other question had to do with Tucson.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is there a herbalist? There is a herbal store in Tucson, Young Herbs, which is on Broadway, and they moved from between Tucson and Country Club on the north side of Broadway to the south side where that ice cream store used to be or still is.
Never been there, Peter. Have you been there?
Oh, yeah, yeah. I've known them for a long time, and they have a Chinese medicine doctor that comes once a week. I don't know if they still have somebody coming once a week. But when I went in, it kind of reminds me when I was growing up in Hong Kong, either grandma or mom will always make me drink some Chinese medicine. It's always dark and black and bitter. So, you know, they have, you know, this Young Herbs, you know, have all the ingredients, all the remedies and the herbs that you can go either with a prescription or if you know what you want, you can go pick up the ingredients that you need. So it's on Broadway. It's called Yang Sung, YONGSHEN Herbs. So it's on Broadway and between Tucson and Country Club Boulevard.
One of the herbs that was grown in the United States, Tamara, is ginseng. Will you agree with me? Ginseng is one of the main herbs that is grown locally in the United States instead of importing it from China.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, another thing I wanted to add, Dr. Shelton mentioned ginkgo biloba. For the longest time, I don't know what ginkgo biloba is. I only know growing up in Hong Kong and, you know, in the Far East, it's called bak go, which is white fruit. So ginkgo biloba is, of course, the clinical name, right? So I know for a fact that there are ginkgo trees here in the United States because I think this is back east, either in Brooklyn or, you know, one of the five boroughs or whatever. There are Asian people, I think they're probably Chinese. They were picking up the ginkgo biloba on the street because they have ripe and fallen on the street. And some of the non-Asian people are, why are these Chinese people picking up these white nut type of a fruit? Well, it's ginkgo biloba. It's expensive and it's good to put it in what Anna was saying, the joke and the porridge, or to use it for any type of other remedies that you can use in a prescription that can make you feel better. And I know that help calm your person if you cannot go to sleep and, you know, make you a little bit more calmer. So I have a whole barrage of questions. So let me kind of read through that. Somebody just said they have a huge ginkgo biloba tree in Baltimore. So
they're pretty. The other tree that's really common here is ailanthus, which I think is commonly called stinking nightshade, I think. And I can actually see one. I'm in my office, and I can actually see one from my office window. They're invasive species in the West, and they were propagated by the Chinese for the purposes of medicine. Chinese railroad workers were kind of propagating them, and then they spread. So yeah, same thing.
Question from Dr. Zhang Hu on UFA campus. He was asking in the early days when the Chinese practice religion, do they have any connections with practice of religion and medicine? Or if they do they worship and practice, together, or it's totally separate?
So, yeah, I mean, traditional Chinese medicine includes what you might think is like talismanic or like temple doctors, a lot of fortune telling, and that does come to the United States. There are a lot of doctors who have that as kind of a secondary, like side business, where they'll prepare certain objects that are considered to be useful in healing. I mean, traditional Chinese medicine, I think it's not as, I guess, dichotomous, right? And sort of separating, this is science, this is the realm of science, and this is the realm of spirituality. Traditional Chinese medicine doesn't really perceive of those as being separate categories. So the origin of your illness might equally be germs, right? Like these sort of microorganisms carrying disease, or it might be demonic possession. And so not very many of the people I write about had that as their sort of main business, but there are plenty in the US, there are plenty of temple doctors, there are plenty of sort of religious practitioners who are doing healing too.
Okay. There was a question. Did the Chinese bring fruit to the US? Was it medicinal?
Did they bring what?
Jujube.
Yeah. Was it medicinal?
Are you talking about Hongzhou?
I don't know what jujube in Chinese is. I know what
Hongzhou. It's in Hongzhou.
Hongzhou is red date, right?
Yeah, Hongzhou.
Okay.
I don't know. Anna, do you know?
I don't know if it's a Chinese tree or not, but I know that we used a lot of Hongzhou jujube.
We eat it. But
yeah,
I don't know.
You can dry it. You can eat it off the tree. But I think what needs to, this is a whole new realm to speak of, but Chinese herbal practice is really basically living a balanced life. Things that you eat influence what you are. Like, how would you say that?
Too much fire. Don't eat
right.
food.
There's it's a balance that we live in. Too much fire and too much cold, or whatever it is. And
no KFC.
Yeah. So that's the whole thing of Chinese dietary practices, which is part of Chinese medicine, I think.
Right. Food is medicine, right? I mean, that's
the
expression, your food is your medicine. So there's, again, there's not that kind of dichotomous thinking. I think we're in Western style medical science, we're very accustomed to kind of like, well, there's this category called medicine, and then there's this category called food. But in Chinese traditional practices, they're all kind of integrated.
Then, so aside from receiving herbal remedies, what other type of healing procedures were being done?
So very often they were doing kind of minor surgeries, like so I do have examples of doctors who would do some excisions, would do surgical abortions. They were bone setters. A lot of them who were, especially those who were working in rural areas where people were working in mines or working in timbering, and very hazardous and very physical jobs. They ended up learning quite a bit of how to perform the kinds of services that people in that kind of physical labor needed.
I think it wasn't common though, as I think.
Yeah, mostly herbalism.
Yeah, but mostly what my dad did, he would create compounds like mud. I don't know what kind of compounds,
like poultices.
Yes, and he'd put it on this sore or whatever it was, and that was as far as he ever went, applying something to somebody's body.
Yeah,
he never cut in, but he would apply these ointments, or he would apply these poultices. I guess it's poultices.
Got paste.
Okay, so I don't see any more questions, but I want to make sure. Let me see the book.
It's hard with the virtual background.
Yeah, the virtual background. So for some of you who have not had a chance to read the book, and would like to purchase a copy, please send an email to Susan at the Tucson Chinese Cultural Center, and they are $30 each, and then we can have them drop ship to you, or you can go on Dr. Shelton's site to learn more about it. Let me see, I don't think I see any more questions. And I know, and again, I want to thank Dr. Shelton and Anna being on here today and sharing with us these topics about Chinese herbal medicine and, you know, the book that she wrote, which, you know, I know a lot of time went into it. I'm going to read it myself, definitely. And for some of you, you know, have any more questions, hopefully in the future when the center is opening up, we can definitely invite Dr. Shelton back, because I know you have family here and I know your father-in-law personally. I know he's traveling a lot right now after he retired from the university. So there's a lot of things to be done and to be seen. But when the centers open up, when we can freely travel and be with each other safely, definitely we would invite you back and have a in-person discussion. And hopefully you have, you know, some more insights to bring to us. So,
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you, Tamara.
Thank you so much, everyone. And
Thank you.
wish you all have a great start to the weekend and stay cool. Thank you so much for your support.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.